Welcome to session 94 in the Worlds of Speculative Fiction series. If this is something new to you, I'm going to tell you about the series in just a moment, but I want to put front and center the work that we're going to be discussing in this particular session. It is Ken Liu's The Grace of Kings, the first book in the lengthy book Dandelion Dynasty series. So I should mention right off the bat what this series is. Worlds of Speculative Fiction. So there is, as you can guess, a big emphasis on examining world building and in speculative fiction. So that includes fantasy, science fiction, alternative history, horror, weird, and with this, silkpunk as well. So what we do in each of these is we look at a coherent narrative world, generally spanning across short stories or novels in a particular author's work, and we delve into it. We look at some of the philosophical themes. If it's the first time treating an author, as it is in this case, we go into their biography. And we also typically will look at, if they're available, what the author has to say about his or her own work. So we've been doing this for about 10 years now. Worlds of Speculative Fiction started out as an in-person series hosted by the Brookfield Public Library in 2016. That continued on in that format until we got locked down during COVID, as you can all remember, and then we went online with the sort of format that we have here, where I will produce a video that covers all of these sorts of things and hopefully is quite engaging. I do a video premiere. The video will typically be between 90 and 120 minutes or so. During the video premiere, I'm there. We're doing live chat so people can discuss the novel, the author, the series, the themes, all of these sorts of things, and we can have a real good discussion. And then after that, we shift over to Zoom so we can carry on the discussion for anybody who's interested in doing so. And as you notice, number 94, we're getting close to having an entire century of these under our belt. Not a century in time, but a century 100 in number. Now, I do need to say a little bit about why we are doing this book and not, as originally planned, the first two books in this interesting series of 4 books. So Ken Liu is one of those authors who, like many, every year I do a kind of, let's have some suggestions, then we'll do a vote. I include 3 sessions that will be focused on somebody that my viewers, fans, subscribers, however you want to frame it, are going to pick. And Ken Liu was somebody who was selected last year, and then we unfortunately just didn't get to him. And I do say unfortunately because I am really enjoying these Dandelion Dynasty novels. So I looked at what we had as a 4-book series. Well, we won't do the whole series. We'll just do 2 of them. And then after reading just The Grace of Kings, which is, by the way, quite a bit shorter than the second book in the series. So I was like, well, I think what we're going to have to do here is what I did earlier in this particular series with Stephen Erickson's Prince of Nothing. trilogy. People wanted me to do that. I really enjoyed reading it, but I was like, there's so much packed in here. I think we're going to have to do each of the 3 books as its own session. And so that is exactly what we're doing. We are doing book 1 this session. Next session, which will be number 95, we're going to do the second book in this series. And then we're probably going to set it aside and get back to what we originally planned for the year. But I can't make complete promises about it. If I get completely captivated by this series, which at this point in time, I would say, maybe 30% chance of that happening, well, then we may be doing books 3 and 4 this year as well. So stay tuned. There'll be announcements about that sort of adjustment to the schedule. That means I'll be making more work for myself next year as I get to the authors who I promised to get to this year and didn't get to after all. But that's okay. It's a fun thing for me to do. I hope that you enjoy it as well. And so I think that what we're going to begin with, as I have done in a lot of the recent episodes of this, is we're going to begin with some preliminary world building examination, what's actually going on in this book and in the Dandelion Dynasty in general. There's a beautiful map, which unfortunately you can't see the whole of because this is a library version. We'll talk about where things are, and we'll do some discussion of the world building. After that, we'll look at Ken Liu's life. He's a living author and still very productive. And then we'll start delving into some philosophical themes. But before that, I think we'll let Ken Liu speak for himself as an author by looking at least 4 recent interviews that he's done that center in particular on this book sort of in that time. And then we'll delve into some really key philosophical themes that are raised by or even discussed in the work by the characters and how things are framed. So settle in. We've got a lot to go over and go into. I hope you enjoy it. And if you haven't read The Grace of Kings, that's okay. You're going to learn a lot about it. There will be some spoilers, but this isn't the kind of work where spoilers are going to keep you from actually enjoying it. And if you have read it, well, you already know how great it is. So if you haven't, I highly recommend you check it out. If you have, well, come along with me and reminisce about what you've read, and we will delve into this really cool world that Ken Liu has set out for us together. Given that this is Worlds of Speculative Fiction, we always focus to some degree on the world building that is involved in the series that we're looking at, in this case, this particular portion of the series, the first book. And what we find as you open the book, even before you get to the pages, is that you get a nice map of this archipelago. Unfortunately, since it's a library copy, they've pasted the jacket to it. So, in order to consult it, I've got to go back and forth or use a map that I printed out. And it is indeed an archipelago world, the islands of Dara. And there's somewhat of a backstory to this that has to do with colonization. So there were some Aboriginal inhabitants in this archipelago, which is composed of one really big island and then a number of other islands basically straddling or circling this big island. And the original inhabitants are the Aduan people. They get displaced to just a portion of it, one of the islands that's actually offset quite a bit, as the Ano people come in, bringing their culture, their gods, their ways of thinking about things, and this goes on for a long time before the beginning of our story, so much that it could even be, you might say, taken for granted by the majority of the people in the story. As a matter of fact, Tan Adu is viewed as, well, this is a really barbaric place. Would you actually want to go off there and be with those crazy people who aren't like us? And as we're going to discuss a bit later, actually looking at this in terms of Liu's own characterization, this is a silkpunk world. Now, what does that mean? Well, a lot of the culture, the characters, the plots are loosely drawn, even the technology in some respects and the material conditions, drawn from ancient China. And, well, China, East Asia more generally. And it's not a China in a new place kind of story. Rather, it's using that as inspiration. As we could say, many other authors in epic fantasy have done with their own works. I mean, this goes all the way back to Tolkien and, drawing upon some things from his own studies and teaching and research as a professor of Germanic languages, developing his own languages and world building and maps and things like that. So Liu is doing this with his island archipelago. I guess I can say kingdom, because it is a united kingdom for part of the story at the beginning of this book and also at the end of the book as well. Maybe even the three-quarter mark after the empire has been devastated, right? And Mata has taken over as the Primarch. In any case, what we've got is a very richly textured, sculpted world in which at the beginning of the story, there has been a unification under one of the states, the Tiro states, that were previously contending with each other for centuries and centuries, and have all been taken over and made part of this empire. And that is clearly a reference to the short-lived Qin dynasty. What's going to arise by the end is sort of a takeoff on the Han dynasty as well. And this is really quite central to Chinese history and identity and all of that. But we also have these times of, it's often talked about as the time of warring states. And this is something that you see not just in Chinese or broader East Asian history. We see this also in what happens in, the time of the Greek city-states, or Alexander and his, the successors, the Diadochoi, or England as, the Norse invade and take over Northumbria, and we've got, Anglo-Saxons and Celtic people, and Vikings and Northumbrians, and then finally Normans fighting against each other, right? So there's lots of this kind of back and forth conflict, and it's happening here in this. So what we should say, I'll give you some outlines of, some very broad outlines that may be helpful. There are a number of different states, and they occupy different places within the map, and they're also known for different things, very, very similar to, other places. So the imperial state is Xana, which consists of two islands. It's way up in the northwest. It's kind of an impoverished state, looked down upon by a lot of people. And what we get his backstory is that Raon, who becomes the king of that state, will, through innovative tactics, using, for example, airships that are filled up, he's got kind of a monopoly on the gas, he's going to take over all of the other states and form them into one vast empire with an entire bureaucracy and hierarchy. He's going to kill off or otherwise subjugate almost all of the royalty of these predecessor states. He's going to proclaim himself the emperor and change his name to Mapidere. And at the beginning of this, actually it begins with this really interesting progression that is happening, something almost like a parade. So I'll just read a little bit of this. So here we go. Thousands of spectators lined both sides of the wide road out of Zudi. They paid the bird no attention. They were here for the imperial procession. They gasped in awe as a fleet of giant imperial airships passed overhead. They gawped in respectful silence as the heavy battle carts rolled before them, thick bundles of ox sinew draping from the stone-throwing arms. They praised the emperor's foresight and generosities as his engineers sprayed the crowd with perfumed water from ice wagons, cool and refreshing in the hot sun and dusty air of northern Kokru. They'd clapped and cheered as the best dancers the 6 conquered Tiro states had to offer. 500 Fasa maidens who gyrated seductively in the veil dance, a sight once reserved for the royal court in Boama. 400 Kokru sword twirlers who spun their blades into bright chrysanthemums of cold light that melded martial glory with lyrical grace. Dozens of elegant, stately elephants from wild, sparsely settled Ekofi Island painted with the colors of the 7 states. The largest male draped in the white flag of Zana as one would expect, while the others were the rainbow colors of the conquered lands, right? And so there's great changes that have been taking place, massive projects, peace of a sort, taxes are high, levies are placed upon the people, and we're actually going to see an assassination attempt made on the emperor by one of the persons who we learn about later as one of the characters, flying a giant war kite that he has figured out a way to no longer have to have on a string, right? And why is he trying to assassinate the emperor? Because there's a view that many hold that this new arrangement is good in certain ways, but also worse in other ways. It is, problematic, right? It is not really worth the trade-off. So let's talk about these states. We mentioned Zana. There's also Amu, and Amu's an interesting state. It includes this giant lake. It's kind of in the north of the big island, and also includes another large island just north of it. It's got a beautiful city called Pan, and this wonderful lake on it. Then we mentioned already Kokru, and this is where Mata is going to come from, as well as some of the other important characters. And this is a martial land. It includes the islands of Tunoa, the Zindu clan that Mata is coming from, which is almost completely wiped out by the emperor, are the traditional marshals, the war leaders of Kokru. And that is indeed what Mata will be for a while until he becomes the new hegemon. Then we have Faka, way over on the other side of the island. Very interested in agriculture and cattle farming. And these lands, many of them are separated from each other by mountains which run in the center of this large island. We have the the state of Gan, which includes this big island called Wolfe's Paw. And this is the wealthiest of the states, very oriented towards commerce, mercantilism. We also have another state on the big island called Rima, which is effectively landlocked in the middle of all of these states, but is protected to some degree at least by these mountains. It is somewhat vulnerable to Faka over to the west, or to the east rather. And then there is Han, a state that includes a lot of scholarship. They're very attentive to that. This is where the philosophers come from, but also, engineers, people who value learning. And these are all different cultures. They have, subdivisions. And interestingly, what we're going to see is there will be, so they begin by being subjugated to the emperor and the state of Sana. So that's going to break down. There will be rebellions, and the former ruling families of some of these states will come back into power. New people will proclaim themselves, sometimes without noble birth, as being the duke or king or ruler or whatever of some of these states. As they rebel, there are going to be shifting alliances. And as Mata Zindu eventually takes over, as the rebellion succeeds and he becomes the new ruler, one of the things that he's going to do is break down these former territories, these subcultures, we could say, into newer, smaller, separate states, which will be all part of the same empire, but sometimes fighting against each other. We're going to see a different sort of configuration at the end, as eventually a rebellion against the former rebel, now primarch or hegemon, is going to take place and supplant them. And this is where the dandelion will beat the chrysanthemum, which we'll come to in just a bit. Before that, though, one of the things that's lurking in the backstory of this world is the fact that there are 8 gods. And these gods, they're all connected with different lands. They have their different animals that are their emblems, their different characteristics. And they are engaging in, you could say, a great game, pitting people against each other, pitting entire countries against each other, or breaking them down from within. So let's talk about these different gods, and we'll just go through them sort of in alphabetical order. There is Fithoweo, who is associated with the land of Rima, this landlocked area. He is a god of war, of the hunt, of the forge. He's often prayed to by those who are going to be fighting, whether they're from Rima or from other places. At times they're, like, wow, Mata must have Fifth Wow on his side because he's winning all these great victories. Then we have the first of a set of twins, Kana, who's a female goddess, who is the patroness, one of them, of Kokru, goddess of fire and ash and death. And actually, let's talk about her sister Rapa as well, kind of diametrically opposed, goddess of ice, snow, glaciers, and sleep. So we've got this interesting balance with the twins there. And then we have Kiji, who is associated with Zana, this dominant power at the time, god of air, wind, flight, and birds. Interesting because the airships are a big part of their military strategy and dominance. We have Lutho, who is associated with Han, this center of philosophy and culture, who is a god not just of fishermen, but also of divination, mathematics, and knowledge. We have, in addition to these, Rufizzo, who is associated with the kingdom of Fasa, who's a god of healing. We have Tazu, who's associated with Gan. And Gan is, this mercantilist place. It's got these crazy whirlpools around it. It is associated with the sea, of course. And so he's the god of the sea, of chance, but also of chaos. And, sort of like what the sea can provide you with or take away. And then finally, we have the youngest of them, Tutotika, who is associated with Amu. And she is an agricultural goddess who's associated with beauty as well, and fresh water. So, it kind of makes sense, right? As this young, beautiful goddess. And so the gods are all playing a contest with each other, using, as best they can, these mortals, occasionally intervening, giving them guidance. And that is part of the story as well, although perhaps less than you might think. And the gods can be thwarted, interestingly. These are not all-powerful deities, that human beings are merely subject to the caprice of these gods. There are a few passages I want to read from the text that I think will give you a little bit of insight into what's going on. And two of them in particular have to do with these flowers. So Kuni, who is one of the main characters, he's going to become eventually the ruler by the end. Kuni is talking very early on with his first wife, Jia, who's also a very interesting character. And they're talking about herbal lore. She is an herbalist. So Kuni says, who knew so much philosophy and wisdom could be hidden among weeds? Here we get another really interesting foreshadowing. You're surprised because the art of herbal healing is a woman's art beyond the notice of real scholars and doctors. Kuni turned to Jia and bowed. I spoke in ignorance. I meant no disrespect. Jia bowed back deeply and jury, you do not assume yourself to be better than anyone. That is the sign of a truly capacious mind. They smiled at each other and kept walking. What is your favorite plant? And then Jia thinks for a moment and she says, well, I admire the dandelion the most. It's hardy and determined, adaptable and practical. The flower looks like a small chrysanthemum, but it's much more resourceful and far less delicate. Poets may compose odes about the chrysanthemum, but the dandelion's leaves and flowers can fill your belly, its sap can cure your warts, its roots calm your fevers. Dandelion tea makes you alert, while chewing its root can steady a nervous hand. The milk of the dandelion can even be used to make invisible ink. That's also foreshadowing that reveals itself when mixed with the juice of the stone ear mushroom. And it's a versatile and useful plant people can rely on. And it's playful and fun. She picked up a puffball and blew at it, scattering the tiny seeds into the air. Kuni made no move to brush them away. The chrysanthemum is a noble flower. That's true. It's the last flower to bloom in autumn, defiant against winter. Its fragrance is exquisite, and it overwhelms all competition. In tea, it awakens the spirit. In bouquets, it dominates the arrangement, but it's not a flower that endears. You don't care much about nobility? I think true nobility is shown in far humbler ways. So, great plot setting there, I think. And we're going to get another very interesting reference to this when the two big characters, Mata and, Kunigaru, are together as friends, as brothers, right? And we're going to see them talking about the two flowers again. So they're all giving comparisons and drinking together And now it was Kunigaru's turn. He stood up, grabbed Widow Wasu, who was passing by with a tray of drinks around the waist, and while she laughed and ducked out of the way, he plucked a dandelion from behind her ear and held it up for everyone to see. "Lord Garu, you compare yourself to a weed?" Koju Yalu frowned. "Not just any weed, Kogzi. A dandelion is a strong but misunderstood flower." Remembering his courtship with Jia, Kuni felt his eyes grew warm. "It cannot be defeated. Just when a gardener thinks he's won and eradicated it from his lawn, a rain would bring the yellow florets right back. Yet it's never arrogant. Its color and fragrance never overwhelm those of another. Immensely practical, its leaves are delicious and medicinal, while its roots loosen hard soil, so it acts as a pioneer for other more delicate flowers. But best of all, it's a flower that lives in the soil but dreams of the skies. When its seeds take to the wind, it will go further and see more than any pampered rose, tulip, or marigold." And then, "Your turn, General Zindu." Mata hesitated. He was not witty or quick on his feet, and he was never good at games like this. But he glanced down and saw the Zindu coat of arms on his boots, and suddenly he knew what he should say. And he's going to give us a poem about the chrysanthemum, which I'll read. "The 9th day in the 9th month of the year, by the time I bloom, all others have died. Cold winds rise and pan streets wide and austere, a tempest of gold and an aureole tide. My glorious fragrance punctures the sky, bright yellow armor surrounds every eye. With disdainful pride 10,000 swords spin to secure the grace of kings, to cleanse sin, a noble brotherhood loyal and true. Who would fear winter when wearing this hue?" "The king of flowers," Koju Yellow said. Mata nodded. So we get already here this very interesting comparison. And what kind of world is it where flowers are so emblematic of these people? A world where technology, gods, magic, history, martial arts and prowess, learning, are all going to come together in culture and in wars and death and famine and oppression, but also the possibility of something greater. So that's enough about world building, I think, for right now. Ken Liu is very much a living author. In fact, he's about 6 years younger than myself, so you could say that he is in the prime of his life as an author, as somebody who's got a lot of big projects both ahead of him and also behind him. So his biography is quite interesting, and I'm not going to talk about every single thing or every work he's published because we want to hit on some of the highlights that I think you could say are informing the Dandelion Dynasty novels, and in ways that you could say are not necessarily all direct, but I would say often get woven into, let's call it the background, right? So he's born as Liu Yukun in Lanzhou, and he's from, you could say, not primarily an academic family, but certainly a well-educated family. His mother is a pharmaceutical chemist. His father is a computer engineer. He grows up with his grandparents, which is always, if your grandparents are good, always quite a benefit. And he credits his grandmother with really promoting in him something that was probably already there, a desire for storytelling. And he reads a lot as a kid, and he's got parents who are encouraging him as well. And then when he's 11 years old, so we're talking about like 1987, his family will move to the United States, where his mother had gotten her PhD from. And first they're living in California, and then they're going to relocate to Connecticut. And they live in several towns there as well. And so he's got, sort of a Americanized life, as many Chinese immigrants do. He adopts a anglicized name, Kenneth, right, and becomes Kenneth Yukun Liu. And then he, of course, shortens it to Ken. He's in high school, graduates from high school in 1994, and goes to Harvard, which is, not surprising given how intelligent he was, or is, rather, as living on the East Coast, has parents who, see this as something important, and there'd be a lot of pushing somebody towards that. So he goes to Harvard, and there he does a very interesting double major. So oftentimes, this is a little bit of a digression, when people double major, they pick two fields that are kind of close together. So maybe they double major in political science and history, or political science and philosophy, or as in my case, philosophy and mathematics, where there's a natural interface there in foundations of logic and thinking about, all sorts of other matters that can be represented mathematically. Instead, he actually majors in two distinct fields, English literature and computer science. And now here's another digression. Think about how in English literature, and not just in the 20th century, but going back a ways, so resistance not just to computerization, because computers are coming a bit later, but to mathematics and mechanical models for things in English literature. Goes back several hundred years as a prevalent theme. So he's reading all this great stuff. He's also learning, the principles of computer science and coding and all of those sorts of matters, and holding all that together in his mind. He's going to graduate in 1998, and he will indeed also go back to Harvard and get his JD, law degree, in 2004, which is not that distant from there. But after he graduates, he's going to work a number of different positions. He gets hired as a software engineer. He will leave that eventually to join a startup. And keep in mind, we're talking about this portion of history which was, we used to call it the dot-com era, right? Because there were so many new startups that were using the internet in interesting ways. It wasn't quite the metaphor of the Wild, Wild West that a lot of people like, but things were not as hegemonic as they currently are, where we have these massive computer/tech companies like, Microsoft, Apple, Facebook/Meta, Google/Alphabet, and Amazon, and several others kind of vying for it. Hulks of contenders like Yahoo laying on the side that didn't quite make it. This was a much more fertile era in which lots of things were being tried out, and lots of them failed as well. So it would be very interesting to have observed that. Eventually, once he does get his law degree, he is going to get a job as a corporate lawyer. As a matter of fact, he talks about working as a tax lawyer and how interesting he found that, a tax attorney, which, by the way, a little bit of trivia, that's what my adoptive father did until his untimely death in 1982. And it's quite an interesting job to have. Eventually, he becomes a litigation consultant, and he is going to work at these kinds of jobs until fairly late, 2017. So we're talking about, at this point, 8 years ago, right? And while his writing career is pretty well underway, and the first two books of the Dandelion Dynasty are actually out. So he's juggling these two sides at the same time, as well as doing some other stuff that we'll talk about in just a bit. So he's very much involved in the world of work, but also reading and thinking and drawing upon stuff. And he begins writing and attempting to get his stuff published way back. The first thing that he does get published is the story Carthaginian Rose in a 2002 anthology. But he said there were a lot of rejections before that, which is a fairly typical story that we hear from many different authors, that it takes a while to get some traction. Interestingly, once he does start getting traction, it really takes off. And so he's going to write a lot of short stories from 2002, or rather publish a lot of short stories from 2002 onward. But it's really going to take off for him if you look at the publication dates from about 2011 onward, where there's a lot more of his stories being published. Interestingly, not coincidentally, he gets a lot of awards and a lot of nominations, and in some cases, like, sweeps the awards in certain years. The big ones for science fiction and fantasy. And that starts happening around the same time, 2011. So he's getting a lot of recognition. I do want to backtrack a bit. In one of his interviews, he says that one of the problems that held him back was concentrating too much on one story that he felt was like, this is the best that I could possibly produce. And he kept on shopping it around and not getting a home at first, and then not taking the time to keep on writing as he felt he should have. He's giving advice to some fellows at that point, talking later on retrospectively about this. So lots and lots of short stories spanning all sorts of interesting topics, which you can check out on your own. We're going to be talking mostly about these novels, the Dandelion Dynasty, specifically the first one. So when does that actually come out? 2015. So he's still working as an attorney at that time. Fairly soon after that, 2016, the much longer Wall of Storms is going to come out. And then there's a bit of a hiatus, you could say, in the four-part series, because Veiled Throne will come out in 2021 and Speaking Bones in 2022. And it's a complete sequence. It's pretty long and dense, lots going on there. And you can see that it's happening over the course of, say, 7 years in terms of publication. He talks about it taking him 10 years of his life in certain interviews. And that's probably right, given all the work that goes into the world building and setting up plots and the actual writing that has to happen. So that's already very interesting. He does have some other novels, and one of these is actually in the Star Wars universe. It's called The Legends of Luke Skywalker, published in 2017, the year that he becomes a full-time writer. And it reminds me a little bit of Alan Dean Foster's Splinter of the Mind's Eye. If you've never read it, you really should check it out. It was set in the Star Wars universe right after Star Wars itself, and it threw a lot of us Star Wars fans at that time for a loop, because when The Empire Strikes Back came out, it didn't match at all with Splinter of the Mind's Eye. And we're like, whoa, what's going on here? So Splinter of the Mind's Eye was actually going to be part of that universe. We can talk about that more later. He also very recently this year published a Julia Z novel, All That We See or Seem. And probably the most interesting work in 2023, he publishes a new translation and interpretation, and that's in the title itself, of Lao Tzu's Tao Te Ching. Now, this is a work that has been translated many, many times, including by other science fiction authors like Ursula K. Le Guin, who Liu, in interviews, says, I read a lot of Philip K. Dick. I also read Le Guin, and these are people that he was quite interested in, and suggests that there may be some affinities between Le Guin's writing and his own. And one of those affinities we already talked about a little bit in terms of the world building, an archipelago, right, that is being explored. So in any case, he publishes the Tao Te Ching, a new interpretation for a transformative time. Isn't that an interesting twist on it, given in that title? Tells you a lot about the purpose of providing yet one more. I mean, there's probably, dozens of translations available of that that very difficult and complex work. Talking about translation work, now this is another thing I find very interesting about Ken Liu. So he's probably best known for translating the works, the trilogy of Liu Cixin, the three-body problem stuff, and that's already a monumental task. Just translating one author would already be quite a bit. Translating one author and one major philosophical work, that's already massive. But he translated works of other Chinese authors to make them more available. Hao Jinfeng, Chen Qifeng, Ma Boyang, among others, and continues this translation work. And it shows, at least from where I'm sitting, and this I think does come through in interviews where he's talking about translation, it's a way of not just being the producer, the writer, who is doing their world building and plots and characters and exploring their own world. It's a form of service. It's a form of community building. It's a way of giving voice to somebody else in a different language that they deserve to have their works read and appreciated in. And I find that quite compelling ethically myself. Maybe you have different views on that sort of thing, but I think that's a good place to end the biography of an author whose work we're now going to explore in greater detail. We're going to hear what he has to say about it, then we'll look at some of the key philosophical themes as I see them. But at least this gives you some sense of where this quite prolific author is coming from in terms of his own life and the orientations and experiences that this has provided him with. Ken Liu has given a number of interviews and said a lot of very interesting things in the course of those engagements with his interlocutors. And so we actually have, we could call it an embarrassment of riches. I've actually had to prune quite a bit and leave out some interviews that I thought would be really fun to get to, but maybe we will in subsequent episodes on the Dandelion Dynasty. So I actually found 4 of them really useful for getting an idea of what Ken Liu not only thought about his work, but the intentions behind it and sort of retrospective discussions about, well, what was I actually trying to do? So let's jump right in and see what he has to say. We'll be bouncing around from several interviews to each other. I'll put links to these below in the video. So let's start with the Bibliosanctum interview. He's asked, can you describe the grace of kings to your new and prospective readers? And so Liu says, at its heart, the grace of kings is a reimagining of the Chu Han contention in a secondary world fantasy archipelago setting. So that gives you a lot of jargon already. Fantasy, right? Secondary world, reference to Tolkien, perhaps to Leguin as well. Think about her essay from Elfland to Poughkeepsie, where she talks about that. And he says, it's the story of two unlikely friends, who we'll come back to later, a bandit and a duke who join together to overthrow tyranny, only to find themselves in opposite sides of a deadly rivalry over how to construct a more just society. Now here we're going to get to a key term. It's also a book that constructs a new aesthetic, silkpunk, which shares with steampunk a fascination with technology roads not taken, but is distinguished by a visual style inspired by Chinese block prints and an emphasis on materials primarily of historic significance to East Asia: silk, bamboo, ox sinew, paper, writing brushes, as well as other organic building materials available to seafaring peoples like coconut, whalebone, fish scales, coral, etc. The result is a technology vocabulary that feels more organic and more inspired by biomechanics. For instance, the bamboo and silk airships compress and expand their gas bags to change the amount of lift and are powered by feathered oars. When illuminated at night, they pulsate and move like jellyfish through an Empyrean sky. Similarly, artificial limbs described in the book draw their inspiration from the wooden ox of Zhu Ge Liang in Romance of the Three Kingdoms, being constructed by intricate wooden mechanisms powered by flexible ox sinew. In the Lightspeed magazine interview, he's asked about the title of his work. He says, well, The Grace of Kings is a quote from Henry V. It's a phrase that's very rich with meaning. It can refer to an exemplar of a king, or to the mercy of a king, or the kind of special morality that kings have to exercise that mere commoners don't have to think about. And the grace of kings is a phrase recurs multiple times in the book, each time in a different kind of guise. It starts out as a very bright phase, but becomes darker near the end, where Kuni has to make a decision whether the grace of kings, in the sense of this is what a king ought to do for the general happiness for the greatest number of people, is, in fact, the right thing to do. Then he's asked, I heard you say the working title was The Dandelion and the Chrysanthemum. He says, well, that's right. The dandelion and chrysanthemum are stand-ins for Kuni and Mata. One of them is very pragmatic, the weed, a very useful kind of plant that's able to survive anywhere. The other is this proud, noble flower with a very strong, dominant personality, whether visually or in terms of fragrance. And yet, the two of them are... here we go. The two of them are sort of similar, as described in the book. They're both golden. And if you squint a bit, a dandelion looks like a small chrysanthemum. The flowers act as recurring symbols, right? And then he says, as far as titles go, the chrysanthemum and the dandelion doesn't tell people what sort of book it is. I'm much happier with the title we ended up using. And then it's pointed out, well, the series as a whole is called the Dandelion Dynasty, so you did keep a little of that in there. And Liu says, yes, but again, the dandelion also is a symbol that transforms throughout the book, and even more so in the sequels. People should not think it means a certain thing. Part of the joy of the series is in the way these images get transformed over time. The book and series as a whole is about continuous revolution and the idea of constant dynamic change. A lot of epic fantasies fall into the Lord of Rings kind of yearning for a golden age of the past, a return to that past. The Grace of Kings is very much a story about the necessity of change and revolution and adapting to changing circumstances. In the Dario Cerello interview, he's asked, your fantasy series, The Dandelion Dynasty, which is a radical departure from your short fiction, has given rise to the wonderful term silkpunk. Can you define it for us and tell us who coined it? And Liu says, well, it's my term. It's shorthand to describe the technology aesthetic I wanted for the novel, as well as my literary approach. Here's the tweet-sized soundbite. War and Peace with silk and bamboo airships, Iliad with living books and sentient narwhals, Romance of the Three Kingdoms with U-boats. If you want to hear more, let me start with what The Grace of Kings is about. It's the story of two unlikely friends, a bandit and a duke, who grow to be as close as brothers during the fight to overthrow an evil empire, only to find themselves on opposing sides of a struggle for the definition of a just society once the rebellion succeeds. Notice the same themes coming up in these multiple interviews. And then he says, when I describe the novel as a silkpunk epic fantasy, I mean I'm writing with and against the tradition of epic fantasy as begun by Tolkien by infusing it with an East Asia-inspired aesthetic that embraces, extends, and challenges fantasy/historical tropes that are assumed to have medieval European or classical East Asian origins. Epics are foundational narratives for cultures, and I wanted to write a modern foundational narrative that draws as much on Chinese epic traditions, like the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, as on Western traditions from Beowulf and the Aeneid. The tale I tell is a loose reimagining of historical legends surrounding the rise of the Han Dynasty in a secondary world archipelago setting. This is a world of politics and intrigue, of love purified and corrupted, of rebelling against tyranny and seeing one's ideals compromised, of friendships forged and sundered by the demands of war and statecraft. There are vain and jealous gods, bamboo airships, and biomechanics-inspired submarines, battle kites that evoke the honor and glory of another age, fantastical creatures of the deep, magical tomes that tell the future written in our hearts. In writing this book, I devoted as much care to technology as to magic, as much attention to art and writing as to war. The text is consumed with the exercise of power, while also imbued with the hope that society is capable of progress. I had such a blast writing it, and I think that at least that authorial joy comes through. Isn't that a wonderful way to cap that? In the Grimdark interview, he's asked, can you tell us a bit about the Dandelion Dynasty? And he says, oh yeah, it's a 4-volume silkpunk epic fantasy series that took up the bulk of my time and creative energy over a 10-year period. And then he says, a preliminary note. I invented the term silkpunk specifically to describe the aesthetic in the Dandelion Dynasty series. Other authors have used my term to describe their own books, and I won't be talking about their uses. My only concern here is my definition for my aesthetic. Now notice this, in creating the silkpunk aesthetic, I was influenced by the ideas of W. Brian Arthur, who articulates a vision of technology as language. The task of the engineer is much like that of a poet in that the engineer must creatively combine existing components to solve novel problems, thereby devising artifacts that are new expression in the technical language. So isn't that interesting as well? And he said, it's not Asian steampunk, it's not Asian fantasy. The punk part is also not a worn suffix devoid of content. To me, silkpunk is about a key punk project, repurposing what was for what will be. These books are my rewriting of the narrative of modernity, and in the later books in particular, the modern American national narrative. This is a vision of modernity no longer exclusively centered on what we think of as the Western experience. Rather, it melds multiple traditions and myths important to me, from the Iliad to Beowulf, from Paradise Lost to Wuxia, and transforms the Chu Han contention into the foundational political mythology of a brand new modern people. Why did I do this? Well, a driving impetus behind this series is my desire to challenge and interrogate the conventional narrative of modernity. So this is showing his hand quite explicitly here to challenge the conventional narrative of modernity. This is speculative fiction that is genuinely deep and speculative. All right, back to the interview, which is often molded on a particular telling of the story of my country, the US of A. The story of America is most often told using allusions to Western models such as classical Rome. But when you are constrained to use one set of allusions, there's a limit to how much you can push readers to see something new in a familiar tale, or even bolder to change the narrative. Something radical had to be done. I decided to depart from the new Rome model and instead evoke East Asian models in this fantasy epic, recasting the story of America, and by extension the narrative of modernity. Thus, I borrowed much of the plot of The Grace of Kings from the Chu Han contention, as interpreted by the historian Sima Qian, and built up a vocabulary of non-Western political allusions and precedents that could be drawn on in the reimagining of the epic of modernity. But the central concern of the Dandelion Dynasty is a series of questions. How could a new nation built from a collection of diverse peoples compose a new constitution, agree on a new source of political legitimacy, rally around a new foundational mythology? How do we carry out a political experiment to build a more just society without creating more injustice? What weight should be given to the wisdom of tradition by revolutionaries? Is it a curse or a blessing that a new generation must contend with the weight of history they are born into and live with the decisions made by their forefathers? Is a perpetual revolution desirable or even possible? So it's clear that the Dandelion Dynasty is motivated by this grand project, right? But there's more. He says, the Dandelion Dynasty is also a series about science and discovery. It's epic fantasy with a heavy dose of sci-fi. I mean, one of the characters literally proclaims the universe is knowable, a manifesto of the scientific view of the cosmos, right? So, jumping down a little bit, he says, before we go too far down these philosophical routes, I should note that it would be just as accurate to say that the Dandelion Dynasty is about young people flirting and partying and being silly and awesome Garanoffen versus airship set pieces and devious battle tactics derived from history, to be sure, but also from the author's experience in playing video games and watching football, and legalistic dirty tricks and deconstructionist misreadings and fantastic engines constructed from silk and bamboo and giant capacitors humming with the power of lightning. I mean, sure, themes are important, but books always need fun. I wrote the book because I had things I wanted to say and I wanted to have fun. Those are the only two good reasons to write a novel as far as I'm concerned. So, lots said there in that interview about what the motivation of the Dandelion Dynasty is and how silkpunk figures into that. Coming back to the Bibliosanctum interview, it said, The Grace of Kings has been described as a mix of many elements, including the combination of Eastern Asian and Western influences, history and fantasy, magic and steampunk. What was the driving force behind the decision to combine philosophies and traditions from such a variety of sources? And then Liu says, well, I've always had trouble writing strictly within genre boundaries, and I don't see fantasy and science fiction, for example, as particularly distinct from each other. For my first novel, I wanted to take some risks and create something that was a novel mix that represented the sort of fiction I wanted to read. That's very important, right? It's not just writing to an audience. He's saying, what would I like to actually read? Coming back to the Dario Chiarello interview, your short fiction can best be described as literary, precise, and intimate. how did you go from being an English major with a passion for the Western canon to writing science fiction? Now, this is a discussion that we've seen many other authors say similar things in. So Liu says, the thing is, I've never thought of genre fiction as standing in opposition to literature. As a result, I've never been interested in efforts to carve out some special aesthetic claim for science fiction or fantasy. To me, all fiction is speculative because all fiction is interested in a mode of rhetoric in which the logic of metaphors is more important than the logic of analysis. What gets marketed as science fiction or fantasy are typically just works that achieve their effect by literalizing their metaphors. The advent of modernism has resulted in an intense interiority being read as the sole mark of psychological realism. Writers who write in the science fiction and fantasy genres, however, can still get away with stories in which the interior drama is being played out through literalized external manifestations. So I view science fiction as having a perfectly valid claim on the Western canon in the same way that the author of Frankenstein was consciously engaged in dialogue with Milton's Paradise Lost throughout her text. In the Lightspeed interview, again being asked, how did the Grace of Kings come about? Now we're kind of shifting topic a little bit, looking at the origins, not just the motives, but the origins of this work. So he says, I wanted to start moving into writing novels, and I didn't have a good subject in mind. I was looking through my short stories, and then my wife, Lisa Tang Liu, said, you and I both have very vivid memories of those historical Chinese dramas based on legends and facts from Chinese history. Maybe you can do something with that, but in a way that feels true to you. I thought that was a really great idea because I do remember those are my favorite stories when I was growing up. I ended up deciding to pick up one of those historical periods, the Shu-Han contention, which is the fall of the Qin dynasty and the rise of the Han in about 200 BC. I said, I'm going to take this period of history when a lot of heroes were rising up all around China, time of great war and change and social contention, and try to reimagine the story as a Western epic fantasy and create a whole new world with new cultures and people in it. Following up on this in the Dario Cerello interview, Dario says, I know that your wife worked with you on creating the universe for this series. What sparked that idea? And Liu says, Lisa and I both grew up imbibing Chinese historical romances as our foundational narratives. She did it by watching TV dramas, and I did it by listening to storytellers on the radio. This conversation sparked in me the thought it would be interesting to transpose a foundational narrative in one culture, the founding of the Han Dynasty, for instance, into a narrative structure built with elements adopted both from the Western and Chinese literary traditions. It had to be done in a way that felt organic, lively, distinct, instead of being just another magical China story that merely validated the Western gaze. Sounded like a tough challenge, which is also a sign it was a project worth pursuing. Lisa and I discussed how such a world should be built and what it would look like and what sort of orientalizing pitfalls had to be avoided to thwart the expectations of the dominant Western interpretive framework. She helped me define the language, culture, and geography of Dara until it felt like a world that could support our dreams. Following up on this, Lightspeed magazine interview, he says, I want to be clear, I didn't set out to write a magical China story. They're difficult to do well in the way that China has been described in Western narratives, the way the West perceives it, makes it hard to tell a story that will escape stereotypes and allow people to perceive it fresh. So I decided to create a new fantasy world, inspired by East Asia and China in particular, but not directly analogous to it. Instead of a continental country, I chose an archipelago and a place of magic as well as technology. The technology aesthetic I'm going for is what I call silkpunk, which is analogous to steampunk. Steampunk is the idea of extending the Victorian-era technology and aesthetics to an alternative path not taken. So silkpunk is one where I take the technology inspirations of classical China, kites, for example, used for military endeavors and signaling, and he goes on and he says, and I blow them up, turn them down an evolutionary path I think they would have taken if they were allowed to develop. So this is a world in which there are magical creatures as well as technological wonders. All of these are based either on direct East Asian analogs or extensions of what's done. In the Grimdark interview, he's asked about Taoism, and he said the interviewer says, could you speak a bit about that and how it influences your writing? And Ken Liu says, well, I think it's actually more accurate to say I'm influenced by three separate yet related philosophical traditions: Taoism, Zen Buddhism, and American Transcendentalism. I wouldn't say everything I write is specifically an instance of Taoism, for Tao is a concept that resists being pinned down and literalized as a metaphor. I do, however, find much appealing in the Taoists' utter contempt for our general obsession with language, with tracks and traces left by reality as opposed to reality itself. The American transcendentalism of writers like Emerson, Thoreau, and Dillard, on the other hand, is a much more direct influence on my writing. There are bits of the Dandelion Dynasty that pay homage to these writers, as well as to the Taoist and Zen Buddhist masters, but the clearest mark they left on my work is an abiding awe for nature's simultaneous fecundity and terror, its utter lack of regard for us, as well as its recurring generosity. Now, coming back to philosophy, but now more political philosophy, in the Bibliosanctum interview, he said, the book is reimagining the events surrounding the rise and fall of the short-lived Qin dynasty, which only lasted 15 years before it gave way to the Han dynasty. What about this period fascinates you? And Liu says, well, the Chu-Han contention is a foundational narrative for Chinese literature, in the same way that epics like the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, Beowulf are foundational narratives for Western literature. Being steeped in both traditions, I wanted to find a way to transpose a foundational narrative from one tradition into the framework of another. So, the novel deliberately melds narrative conventions taken from these two very different traditions. There are wuxia-style flashback character introductions, as well as Anglo-Saxon-style kennings, poems based on Tang Dynasty models, as well as songs imitating Middle English lyrics, rhetorical devices taken from Greek and Latin epics, as well as formal descriptions reminiscent of Ming Dynasty novels. So all of these are supposed to connect together in this new format. And then he's asked, well, what kind of research did you do for the book? This is very interesting. I read the source text, Sima Qian's Records of the Grand Historian, carefully noting interesting things he did with the characterization and shifting points of view. Most of the research, however, involves studying theories of technology and the evolution of technology. Once again, W. Brian Arthur's work in this regard was particularly edifying, right? So Liu is bringing together a number of different philosophical, let's say, traditions and resources in his conceptualization of this vast work. Now, we come to characters. I mentioned we would talk about them a bit. The Lightspeed magazine interview has a lot of discussion of that. He's asked, tell us about the heroes of the story, because there's two main protagonists, Kunigaro and Mata Zindu. And Liu says, well, they're two men that represent polar opposite qualities. Kunigaro is a commoner who isn't ambitious. He doesn't care about learning or climbing the social ladder. He just wants to have fun and do the interesting thing. Mata Zindu is the descendant of a very important and powerful family of nobles who've always been great generals in Dara. At the beginning of the novel, we find out that the islands of Dara, which had been divided into separate kingdoms, were forcibly united by one of them, and the new emperor has a very harsh rule. What Mata wants to do is restore the world to how it used to be with separate kingdoms, whereas Kuni wants to see if he can make his life a little better and help the people he loves live more interesting and happier lives. These two unlikely protagonists become leaders in a subsequent rebellion against the empire. They get together, and it turns out they're good friends because their strengths and weaknesses complement each other. The story is about their friendship and their rise together against the empire until, as they near success, they find that their different ideals about how the world can be made more just and better are utterly incompatible. In addition to these two characters, he's asked, there are a lot of other characters in the book, including, interestingly, a tax collector named Kindo Marana. So he's being asked about that, and Liu says, well, I was a tax attorney for something like 7 years. I was a tax geek. I was really into it. Tax is one of those things that people think is incredibly boring, but like any kind of science about systems, once you get into it, it becomes incredibly intricate and interesting. Because I love tax topics feature a lot in my fiction. I once wrote a science fiction short story centered around the idea of an alien tax code and the idea that you can understand the society by parsing their tax code. I'm going to say a little bit here as well. So my father, who unfortunately died when I was quite young, was a tax attorney, just like Liu. And I remember in high school, college, my dad's old tax books that my mom had kept, his books from when he was studying tax law, I'd open them up and I was like, wow, my God, this is boring stuff. And then I went to graduate school and I got into political philosophy. And I came back and I remember opening up those books and seeing them with new eyes and being like, whoa, this is about a whole bunch of levers for incentivizing and disincentivizing and, making sure that some things happen and other things don't happen. This is where political philosophy meets the pragmatic realities of economies and systems. So I really get what Liu is talking about there. Going on, he's asked, another character that really struck me was Zato Ruthie. There's a really interesting portrayal of scholars and intellectuals in this book. Tell us about that character. So Liu says he's a scholar who also ends up being king through a series of accidents. The portrayal of scholars is pretty critical to the book. And that's another thing that distinguishes this from an epic fantasy that derives from a more magical medieval Western Europe tradition. Scholarship has always been respected in classical China, and the kind of classical learning they specialized in was often valorized to a degree that it wasn't in medieval Europe. I wanted to preserve that feel, and so this is a society in which scholarship is a way for you to ascend in the world by being able to serve in the imperial bureaucracy. Zato Ruthie was a brilliant scholar, but he didn't want to go serve the imperial bureaucracy. He wanted to go in the woods by himself and start contemplating how to make the world better. Through a series of accidents, he becomes a figurehead for the revolution that was held. So he becomes the king of one of the Tiro states, not because he wanted to, but because he was a compromise candidate all the political interests in question could agree upon. And it turns out that he was a terrible king, because his ideas about what is moral and what is the right thing to do are incompatible with political and military realities. Going on a bit more, tell us about the character Mazzotti. Jin Mazzotti is an interesting character. She is added as an agent of change. Early on, before you meet Mazzotti, this is a world in which by custom it is the men who do the fighting, and because of this it is a novel about warfare. There's a huge amount of scenes and events where the only participants are men. But then things change, because Jia, Kuni's wife, convinces him that when he's weak and not in power, he needs to leverage other sources of power, other individuals and other groups who have also been disenfranchised by society. The people who already have power are not going to help him because he wants to upset their gains. It's the people who don't have anything who will help them, and among these people, the most prominent are women. Jin Mazzotti ends up coming into Kuni's service, and she is a street urchin who grew up in the streets of Metropolis and worked for a gang of thieves and had a very difficult backstory where she was not able to get a proper education. Fortunately, she comes to be helped by a dock master who teaches her how to read and discovers she has a talent for recognizing patterns and thinking in a strategic way about how to fit pieces together. It's this kind of big picture, strategic kind of thinking that makes her a great general. She's not the ultimate fighter. That's not her thing. She can fight, but she's not going to be able to overcome in single combat somebody like Mata. She shows that to be a great general, what you really need is leadership and the ability to think tactically and use guile. As I mentioned, the series is about revolution and dynamism. So at the end of book 1, you see that the society of Dara has changed. A lot of the women characters are playing very important roles because they forced themselves onto the stage by leading a revolution that succeeded. They now have a stake in the way politics and those affairs are conducted. But with every revolution, there's always a backlash. So we'll talk about that in subsequent books. Finally, the last bit is from the Dario Chiarello interview. And he brings up roots, memory, and identity, the sense of straddling two cultures, and the need to either reconcile them or fully commit to one is a recurring theme in your short fiction. As an immigrant yourself, I believe you were 10 when you arrived in the U.S. Is this a process you still struggle with? And Liu says, struggling with narratives of identity is at the heart of the experience of modernity. I would say that resistance to the false narrative of straddling two cultures is definitely a recurring theme in my fiction. The notion that immigrants are somehow torn between cultures and act as the contested battleground for clearly defined and irreconcilable dueling cultural narratives from which they must choose one is simplistic, reductive, and to put it bluntly, wrong. And yet it is a notion that shows up again and again in how we discuss cultural difference. I'm far more interested in stories that explore the ways in which all of us are defined by, but also define the cultures which claim us and how we negotiate the boundaries between self and society, between conformance and estrangement. As an American who claims a proud identification with my Chinese cultural inheritance, I'm particularly interested in stories that challenge the assumptions behind what it means to be American or Chinese, and reveal these categorizations as attempts by the powerful to assert dominance over fluid, unstable, always forming identities. He finishes by saying, we live in a world that is defined by historical injustices, and it's a mark of privilege for someone to declare history to be irrelevant. The descendants of historical winners are the only ones who can afford to ignore history. I write stories that stubbornly and perhaps unrealistically cling to the hope that it is only by understanding and empathizing with the pains of historical suffering and accepting the burden of historical injustice that we can truly be free. So, ending on a kind of utopian motif, but one that has to do with modernity and tells us a bit about what Liu takes himself as doing in his storytelling. So we have a very complex, rich narrative that he has worked out from multiple perspectives, bringing together philosophies, technology, culture, literary tropes, all of these sorts of things in a very deliberate, artistic way. The first grand philosophical theme that I wanted to discuss might actually be a bit of a misnomer. It's not so much a single philosophical theme, but more, we could say, the prevalence of philosophy emerging here and there within the story and playing a pretty important role. And when we say philosophy singular, that's probably a wrong way to make sense of it. It's philosophies plural. So if you know much about classical Chinese philosophy, when you're reading various positions that are being staked out by some of the main characters, or even more minor characters within the vast plot of this work, you can say, aha, that looks like the legalism that was prevalent in the Qin dynasty and then became sort of surreptitiously incorporated into the Han dynasty, or that looks like Taoism. We've already talked about the importance of that to Liu in the interviews, or this looks like Confucian attitudes, perhaps even Moism, we could say, emerges at various points in thinking about means and ends. And then there's all sorts of other bits and pieces that are going to turn up here. So it's not just stand-ins for classical Chinese philosophy. So we could call this a metaphilosophical theme, the importance of philosophies and their appropriateness for given circumstances. And I've got a lot of passages sort of picked out that I want to read to you, and we'll go through. So beginning early on, this is during the Zana Empire occupation. we read that the 7 states had coexisted for more than 1,000 years, and but for that tyrant from Zana, they would have existed for 1,000 more. The kings of the Tiro states were the ultimate secular authorities, the anchors from which 7 parallel great chains of being dangled. They enfiefed lands to the nobles, who kept the peace in his domain and administered it like a miniature Tiro state. Each peasant paid his taxes and labor to a lord, and each lord to his lord, and so on up the chain. The wisdom, so there's the key, of the Tiro system was evident in the way it reflected the natural world. In the ancient forests of Dara, each great tree, like a Tiro state, stood independent of the others. No tree held sway over another, yet each tree was made of branches, and each branch of leaves, just as each king drew his strength from his nobles, and each noble from his peasantry. It was same with the separate islands of Dara, each composed of islets and lagoons, bays and coves. This pattern of independent realms, each composed of miniature copies, could be found in coral reefs and schools of fish, in drifting forests of kelp, in mineral crystals, and in the anatomy of animals. It was the underlying order of the universe, a grid like the warp and weft of the rough cloth woven by corkscrew craftsmen, formed by horizontal lines of mutual respect among equals and vertical lines of downward obligation and upward fealty, in which everybody knew their place. So an earlier idealized order that is analogized to nature. Emperor Mapidere had eliminated all that, swept it away like the armies of the 6 states, like fallen leaves in autumn. A few of the old nobles who surrendered early got to keep their empty titles and sometimes castles and money, but that was all. Their lands were no longer theirs because all land belonged to the Zana Empire, to the emperor himself. Instead of the scholars of each Tiro state writing with their own sets of logograms and arranging the Zindari letters in their own fashion, bound up with local tradition and history, everyone now had to write in the manner of Zana. Instead of each Tiro state determining its own systems of weight and measures, its own way of judging and seeing the world, everyone now had to make their roads as wide as the distance between the wheels of a cart from the immaculate city, their boxes as big as could be packed tightly into a boat from the port of Criffy, the former Zana capital. All sources of loyalty, of local attachment, were replaced with allegiance to the emperor in place of the parallel chains of devotion forged by nobles. The emperor put in a pyramid of petty bureaucrats. In this new world, the old orderly way of life was lost. Nobody knew his place. Commoners were living in castles, while nobles huddled in drafty huts. So, this is kind of a dramatic take on the empire. But you see, some very interesting themes being brought up here. The emperor himself has this interesting vision of the gods, and we read some other things. The emperor had long dreamed of confiscating all the weapons of Dara, all the swords and spears, all the knives and arrows, and melting them down into their constituent metals so they could be turned into statues honoring the gods. Without weapons, there would be eternal peace in the world, right? So it doesn't actually succeed, but, the emperor has some pretty grand ideas that he is trying to elaborate within the fabric of society itself. Now, moving on to another person, a scholar, Krupo, and he's going to come up again when we look at the issue of betrayal. So Krupo had been born in Kokru, back when it was still the strongest among the incessantly warring states. His parents' propertyless bakers in a small town died during one of these border skirmishes. He was captured by bandits and taken to Han, the most learned of the Tiro states, to be sold as a bonded servant. But in Jinpen, the Han capital, the constables raided the bandits and freed Krupo into the streets. And so as he begged for food in the streets of Jinpen as a refugee, the great scholar Jin Anji, the famed lawgiver and advisor to many kings, passed by. And he saw something in little Lugo Krupo's dark brown eyes that moved him, a spark of yearning for something greater, not just hunger for food. And Krupo became Anji's students. He was not one of those bright boys who mastered subjects effortlessly, like Tan Feiuji, the precocious son of a famous Han scholar and Ji Anji's favorite, and he had a hard time adapting to Anji's school. Anji's favorite method of instruction was to engage in a group dialogue with his students, asking them carefully crafted questions that probed their understanding, challenged their assumptions, and led them down new avenues of thought. Whereas Feiuji could immediately come up with 3 different answers whenever Anji asked him a question, Krupo struggled to even understand the point Anji made by asking it. Krupo had to work hard for every bit of progress. So he persevered. He wanted more than anything to please Master Anji. And if that meant that he had to read the same book 3 times to absorb the meaning, that he had to practice carving and writing the same logograms 100 times, that he had to sit and work out a parable like a puzzle for hours, he did them all without complaint. He was the very definition of diligence. As he squeezed every minute out of the day to study. He read while he ate. He did not play games with the other boys. He sat on sharp pebbles instead of sitting maps so he would concentrate instead of becoming too comfortable and falling asleep. Gradually, Krupo became one of Anji's best students. When speaking to kings, Anji often mentioned that of all the young men he taught in his life, only Feiuji and Krupo had understood everything he had to teach them, and then had gone on to the terra incognita of new ideas. So very interesting reflection on scholarship there. And now we come to one of the passages that I thought was particularly interesting and important. So we've mentioned Han already a little bit. This is where Krupo is. In high-minded Han, scholarship had been not just a luxury, but a way of life. Before the Zana conquest in the countryside next to the broad, reedy tidal flats and rocky beaches, countless learning huts used to sprout up like sandcastles. The tutors in these huts, paid for by the state, instructed the children of the poor in reading, writing, and basic proficiency with numbers. So public education, kind of. More talented and wealthy students went to Jinpen, the capital and home to Dara's most renowned private academies. Many of Dara's greatest scholars spent their formative years within the lecture halls and laboratories of the academies. Tan Feiuji, we encountered before, the philosopher who elaborated governance into an art form. Lugo Krupo, regent of the empire, peerless calligrapher. Gi Anji, who taught them both. Huzo Tuan, who defied death to criticize Ma Pidere to his face, and many others. In Old Han, a traveler could stop any farmer walking through the fields and have a conversation about politics, astronomy, agriculture, or meteorology and learn something. In Jinpen, even a common merchant's assistant clerk could calculate cube roots and fill out magic squares with no assistance. In tea houses and wine bars, though the food was plain and the drink merely passable, one could encounter the most brilliant minds of Dara debating matters of political and natural philosophy. Though Han wasn't the most industrious of the Tiro states, her engineers and inventors created the most sought-after designs for watermills and windmills and made the most accurate water clocks. But all this changed after the conquest. Compared with other Tiro states, Mapire's book burning and scholar burying had dealt a harsher blow to Han's spirit. The learning huts were no longer funded and fell into disuse. Many of the private academies in Jinpen closed, and the few that survived were mere shadows of their former selves, where scholars were afraid to give true answers and more afraid to ask real questions. And then, we learn about Luan Zia. And he is going to grow up as the 6 states fall. And he, travels from place to place, learning as much as he can. And he's a person who, is not just interested in divination, but he is able to think through things. Unable to find out how to proceed from the gods, Luan focused on matters in this world. His knowledge of mathematics was not limited to the realm of divination alone. And we find out that he can actually, become quite a talented engineer. Later on, he's going to encounter a man who's going to give him a book, a heavy one. While scrolls filled with wax logograms were used for poetry and song, books like this one, dense codices made from thin sheets of paper bound together, were packed with Zindari letters and numbers, suitable for note-taking and passing on of practical knowledge. Leguin flipped through it and saw it was filled with equations and diagrams for ingenious machines and for new ways to understand the workings of the world, many of them elucidations and amplifications of ideas he'd already been aware of, but only dimly. Understanding nature is as close as men can get to understanding the gods, the old man said. Leguin tried to read a few pages and was overwhelmed by both the text's density and its elegance. He could spend a lifetime studying these pages. Continuing to flip through, he saw that the second half of the book was blank. The old fisherman smiled and mouthed, "Watch." Leguin looked down and was astonished to see that figures and words began to appear on the formerly blank page. Right? And then the old man says, "The book grows as you grow. The more you learn, the more there is to learn. It is an aid to your mind, an extension of your capacity for seeing order and chaos for invention. You shall never exhaust its knowledge, for it is replenished by your curiosity, and when the time is right, it will show you what you already know, but haven't dared yet think." So I'm going to skip ahead a good ways to talk about somebody who also can recognize patterns and grasps things very interestingly. And it's a woman who is going to rise to become the first female marshal of a state, Jin Mazzotti. And we learn that she has a very, very rough childhood, and she learns to play this game from a dockmaster who takes pity on her, Kupa. The game was played with formations of black and white stones on a grid, and the object was to surround the other player's stones with one's own and take over the board. This is the game of Go, right? And we find out that she is going to play with this Kogu Yalu, who is the advisor to Kuni. And she is going to beat him by superior strategy with this game. So then Kunugaru asks her, "I'm all ears for your advice on my state." Gin was touched. A king was serving her. Even though he knew she was a woman, he treated her just like the great strategist she claimed to be. Perhaps this was a lord she could serve and serve well. And she is going to come up with some really innovative strategies. But here's something very interesting that I found very compelling about her. So she institutes new training, and she says, she told her officers the job was not only to carry out the orders of the chain of command, but to improvise on the basis of changing battlefield conditions. Every officer, Mazzotti explained, from herself all the way down to a lowly corporal leading a squad, needed to think of themselves as the head of a living organism fighting for survival, and every advantage must be exploited. If that involved unorthodox tactics that broke written or unwritten laws of war, so be it. In war, our only goal is to win. So she holds Kupa lessons and promotes the game throughout the army. Then we also read, she wasn't just teaching the officers and foot soldiers, she was also teaching them how to teach. The Dasu army was going to have to grow a lot if the snake was going to swallow an elephant, and she needed to install values and practices that would scale. Very, very interesting. The last thing I'm going to bring up about her, training is not the only thing Mazzotti focused on. The marshal also held meetings with small groups of ordinary soldiers to hear their concerns. These were based on the administrative experiences of Lord Garu and Prime Minister Yellow, and they were as effective with the fighting men as they were with ordinary citizens in Zudi and Dasu. So that is, a very telling way of using one's mind. Later, we're going to see somebody who is a scholar who is going to lose to this great female marshal. His name is Zato Ruthi. He's a scholar and memorized all the numbered sayings of the ancient Ano epigrammist. He read all the commentaries on the ancient automoral philosophers Kanji's treatise on an ideal society, disdaining the civil service examinations because they interfered with the pure contemplation of ideas. He refused to seek gainful employment, but journeyed deep into Rima's ancient woods to study in a tiny hut. He was recognized by 30 as one of the greatest scholars of ancient philosophy in all of Dara, the entire world, a rival of Tan Feuji and Lugo Krupo, though he'd never studied in the famed academies of Han. He ends up becoming the king of Rima as sort of a compromise candidate, and then he makes them fight according to what he calls the laws of war, according to moral philosophy. And Jin Mazzotti is going to beat him very handily. "You disobeyed the laws of war," King Zato said. He knelt before Marshal Mazzotti in the palace of Nathion, but his voice was defiant. "Have you ever read the books of Khan Fiji?" He had some good ideas to say about government, Mazzotti replied, but he didn't know anything about how to fight a war. King Zato shook his head sadly. "You cannot win true victory if you don't follow the laws of war. You are only a woman, after all, and you do not understand the greater principles involved." "Right," said Mazzotti, smiling. She didn't want to execute the old fool. Instead, she sent him to Damushi, where Kunigari might find him entertaining. Isn't that a good one there? The last thing I'm going to bring up is actually a really important set of passages that are taking place as Kuni is deciding whether to break the rules, the treaties, the ceasefire that he's made with Mata. So he's talking with Luan, and Luan is advising him, "You should break the treaty." And Kuni says, "The war's gone on long enough. Mata and I, neither of us can overcome the other. I've put my seal on the document, and it's done." And Luan says, "This is the best opportunity to attack them." And Kuni says, "I'll be remembered by history as a great betrayer." And Luan says, "The judgment of history cannot be ascertained from up close. You see the condemnation of the people of this generation, but you can't foresee how their descendants will view your deeds in the future. If you don't attack now and end this war, the killing will never stop." So kind of utilitarian argument going there. That could be compatible, by the way, with Moist philosophy, as well as like legalist philosophy or things like that. So finally, Kuni says, "Is there no room for mercy, no sympathy among gods or men?" And then Luan says, "Mercy for your foes, my king, is the same as cruelty to your friends." That sort of logic, Luan, could become the salve and loincloth for all tyrants. Queen Jin has always argued that if one goes to war, one should do all one can to win. A knife is not malicious merely because it is sharp, and a plot is not evil merely because it is effective. All depends on the wielders. Now notice this line. "The grace of kings is not the same as the morals governing individuals." Kuni did not respond. "If you do not make use of every advantage given to you, the gods will condemn you for your error." And then here's the line that we're going to end with here that opens up so much room for discussion. "I think I wield power," Kuni said, "but perhaps it is power that wields me." So, very interesting expressions, uses of various philosophical positions lived out, committed to, in this great novel. Among the many philosophical themes that we could be focusing on that are either raised or displayed within this novel, one that I find particularly captivating and well thought out is this complex interplay in relationships having to do with love and loyalty, but also the possibility and the actuality of betrayal. And you could say that some of the characters, including Mata Zindu, are going to have this viewpoint after a while that everybody is ultimately out for themselves. I can't trust anybody unless I'm watching them. Some will embrace treachery. Others will be tempted by it and not give in to it for reasons that we'll talk about in a bit. And usually it has to do with getting some decent counsel from somebody else. And then there's those, like Cooney, who will ultimately, against his own wishes, have to choose betrayal. So I've picked out a number of passages, as always. I'm not sure that we'll get to all of them, but I do want to begin with several that I think are particularly compelling. So this is about halfway through the work, and Mata and Cooney are already, working with each other, viewing each other as brothers, and there's been this betrayal that's taking place that we'll come back to on the part of his uncle in terms of this very brilliant woman who was sort of, she could have been a ruler, and she's being used as a tool to try to break up the rebellion. So what we read here is that his uncle is sending Mata away. He says, I'm in charge of the rear guard only. I must leave within the week to begin preparations. My duty is to play harbor master and guard the peninsula in case there has to be a retreat. And Mata says then, she said she would not choose between us, and so he decided to make the choice for her and get me out of the way. It's his way of demonstrating how much power he has over me to belittle me. He's taking away my chance for glory. And then Cooney is going to say, it's not good to speak this way, brother. You and the marshal are two pillars holding up the sky over Kokru. Discord like termites in the foundation is an infestation that must be plucked out, lest it bring ruin upon all of us. You have a duty to focus on the task at hand. The lives of men depend on you. And then Mata says, I am not the uncle who stole a nephew's woman, Cooney. I am not the one who betrayed a bond of trust. He's a weak old man, and if he always relied on me to fight his wars for him, maybe it's time I stopped. And then Cooney says, enough, you're drunk and know not what you say. I'll go with you, Mata, to the Maji Peninsula. Forget about the fickle woman. She has played with both of your affections. She's not worthy of your anger. Do not speak ill of her. Mata got up and tried to strike at Cooney, but he stumbled and missed. So, quite a scene there, right? Now, later on in the story, it's going to be a matter of the household, and Jia is Cooney's wife, and we have this interesting character, Soto, right? And Soto is going to be giving Jia some advice. So before this, what we have is Otho is going to become the sort of bodyguard and you could say a steward of the household, right? Why? Because Cooney can't be there, and she feels alone. A heated thought rose into her mind. She resented Cooney for leaving her behind like this. She felt bad immediately and tried to push the thought away, but that only made it linger and hurt worse. So what does she do? We find that she comes to Otho and begins to undress him in the dark. And he's attracted to her. And they lay together in the darkness, their bodies sliding against each other hungrily, desperately, their mouths meeting in urgent kisses that sought time and timelessness in equal measure. So now they're in effect cheating, right? And she's doing it in part out of resentment, out of anger. Then they hire this housekeeper, Soto. And Soto is going to give her some interesting advice, and Soto lay awake in the darkness thinking. Jia could be a force to become reckoned with, a shaper of the path of the rebellion, so that its fruits might taste sweet for more than just men like Mata Zindu, men who looked to an ideal past but were blind to messy realities. Soto hoped to nudge Jia along the path that she was meant to take, which would require Soto to reveal the truth of her own past. But now she knew of this wrinkle in Jia's life. She had to consider what it meant. There was a tendency by some to romanticize love, to make a fetish out of it. The poets made love seem like a bar of iron coming out of the furnace at the blacksmith's, red hot and staying so forever. Soto did not think much of such notions. A man fell in love with a woman, married her, and the passion would cool. He would then go into the world, see other women, fall in love again, marry them, and feel the new passion cool in turn. After all, in the Tiro states, a man was allowed to have multiple wives if he could persuade all the wives to agree. But if he was a good man, the passion would cool into a smoldering ember ready to be fanned to flame again. As the great Khan Fiji wrote so long ago, a good husband remained in love with all his wives, but being good took hard work, and most husbands were lazy. It was no different from how a lonely wife away from her husband would seek comfort in a lover. Yet for the most part, she would not be lying to say that she still loved her husband. For both women and men, Soto believed that love was more like food. The same dish tired the palate, and variety was spice. The world did not tolerate such betrayals by the wives, if betrayal was what they were, as it tolerated the same betrayals by husbands. But the world was wrong. Accommodations for the vagaries of the heart should be made for women as well as men, Soto thinks. Let's come back to Soto again. So, and all of this discussion. So, Cooney realizes what's going on. He's talking to Soto. And he says, I'm not blind. I can guess what happened. Otho has always liked Jia, and I decided long ago to trust them rather than to act the part of a jealous lord of folk operas. But perhaps I've been a fool. Not at all. You haven't raged or been petulant, which speaks well of you. You know that you've never been absent from Jia's heart. I haven't reacted the way you might have expected because I've done things while I was away too, things I'm not proud of. It is the rare man who would be as severe with himself as he is with his wife, said Soto. I was glad to see I was not wrong about you. The sages and Anno classics tell us that faith means one thing for a husband, another for a wife, but you are clearly not a man who accepts received wisdom. Cooney gave a little chuckle. I've always thought it was nonsense to believe something true simply because it was written in a book long ago. Mata is the one who thinks the past was perfect, but I think we must perfect the present for the future. I believe she did what she did because she thought it was necessary, and I would not act the hypocrite. Great men and women are not constrained in the forms their loves may take, Soto. You and Jia may love others, but in each other's estimation, you'll always be first among equals. And then Soto has a conversation with Jia. She says, you're angry with your husband. And what is Jia angry about? I'm angry that he takes being a king more seriously than being a husband, right? And then Soto is going to say she's actually got some pretty great discourses here. This is my point, Jia. The heart is a complicated thing, and we're capable of many loves. Though we're told we must value one to the exclusion of others, you can be a good wife at the same time that you're a good mother, though sometimes the needs of your husband may seem to conflict with the needs of your children. You can be loyal to your husband at the same time that you take a lover for your own sake, though the poets tell us this is wrong. But why should we believe that the poets understand us better than we do ourselves? Do not retreat into conventionality because you're afraid, as you already suspect, your husband may understand you better than you think. So what's going to end up happening is Jia is actually going to tell Cooney, okay, you're off on this island, you need to take another wife and act as if things are essentially done between us so that you can lull Mata into complacency. And he will find somebody, Risana. And Risana is an interesting person. Soto is going to give both Jia and Risana good advice. He will have children with both of them. And this is perhaps going to lead to problems later on. But Jia is able to resist the temptations of jealousy and feeling that she's being betrayed. And Risana actually has a very interesting talent. Whereas her mother had been skilled in planting suggestions in an audience while smoke dulled their senses, Rhysana was best at the opposite, clearing the minds of those in thrall to the smoke. She was the one who would lead them out of the labyrinths after they'd had their fun, the one who would show them that the monsters they thought they saw were not real. So she's got the possibility of manipulating people, but she wants to instead help people have clarity. Even without the aid of her herbal smoke, she'd always find it easy to speak with people. She had a talent of seeing what was in their hearts through the fog and smoke of their self-deception and their wish to seem other than they were. Most of the time, she chose to go along with the deception. Indeed, that was often what it took to be well-liked. But sometimes, when she thought the person needed it, she did something different, with a word, a song, a judiciously enforced bit of silence. She showed them what she had seen, giving them that most precious of truths, acceptance of the truth. And she thinks that perhaps Cooney is one of the hearts that's obscure to her sight, but she realizes that Cooney was a complicated man. He was like a cabbage, one leaf nestled inside another, each half-formed idea enclosed by another, desires and suspicions and regrets and ideals wrapped tightly lest they spread too far. There was a growing ambition in him and an overwhelming desire to be liked, but there was also sorrow and a gnawing sense of doubt, of not being as good a man as he thought he was, of not being as certain of the right path as he wished. Cooney was the sort of man who, rather than deceive himself, was so filled with self-doubt he could no longer see himself. And so she is going to become a very important wife to him, and they're going to have to resist the temptation to pull things apart. Now, a great example of that is going to be what happens with Mata, who, has all these betrayals one after another, and views Cooney as a brother, and then something happens, something that tilts the scales. So it's after Cooney has struck this blow that toppled the empire. Marshal Zindu's army approached Goa cautiously and sent out scouting parties. At the last barrier before Pan, Thoko Pass was likely heavily defended. Doro Solofi, captain of the scouts, came back with the surprising news that the red flags of Kokru were flying from the walls of Goa. Matu Zindu took a few personal guards and rode up to Goa's gates. "Open up," Ratho called out. "We're with Marshal Zindu, commander-in-chief of all rebel forces. Who's your commander?" The soldiers peeked carefully over the wall. "Without Lord Garu's orders, we won't let anyone through." "Lord Garu? You mean Kuni Garu, the Duke of Zudi?" "The very same. Though now that he's captured Emperor Irishi, he's going to be king of Gafika." Mata rode forward. "He's done what? Open up the gates now and let me speak to him." And then the defenders shoot arrows at them. And this tilts Mata over into deciding that Cooney is trying to betray him. And in the end, Cooney will have to betray him after they've made the peace treaty. We find out in that phrase that we've already looked at, "I think I wield power, but perhaps it is power that wields me." Immediately after this, Cooney sighed in resignation and tore the paper into pieces. In a minute, the pieces had disappeared in the wind like words spoken and then forgotten. So this is an actual betrayal that Cooney did not want to be forced to. But why is he? Not because he's being manipulated, but because Mata Zindu sees everything so black and white himself. You're either with me or against me. You're betraying me or you're my loyal friend. And in the end, he has no loyal followers to draw upon. A few before he dies. But that is what concludes it. And now the question is, can this empire, which is dependent on people, be held together by the bonds of loyalty and trust and fidelity? Or will there be, as it always seems to be, opportunities for people to go awry through jealousy, envy, ambition, and to betray each other? And for that, we have to wait for the following novels. So this is a fitting place to end this particular discussion. I hope that if you haven't read The Grace of Kings, that you'll go out and get your hands on a copy, either purchase it, go to a library, and that you enjoy it and find it as deep and thoughtful as I do.